Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Dutch Atlantic Association and the Roosevelt Institute for American Studies, it is a pleasure to welcome you, both here live and online at home, in Nieuwsport for this special event. And it is a real honor to welcome our keynote speaker, Professor Tosh Minohara. Today's program focuses on China and Japan, but in a way it is a follow-up of the discussion organized by the Atlantic Association last Thursday. That was a discussion with 4 Dutch experts on the strategic impact of the American retreat from Afghanistan. The impact in particular on the transatlantic alliance. But today we look at the strategic impact from an Asian perspective, with a special eye on China's challenge and the long-term implications of AUKUS, the new military alliance between the United States, the United Kingdom and Australia. The leading question of today's program is East Asia in particular, heading towards a tumultuous decade? That question has an ironic twist, as East Asia has no lack of turbulent periods in its history, even its recent history. But there can be no doubt that the assertive, if not aggressive way in which China claims a dominant role on the world stage, and certainly in the East Asian theater, forms a new and serious challenge for peace and security. We are fortunate to have with us an eminent scholar who can deepen our understanding of all the strategic issues of East Asia. Professor Minohara teaches US-Japan relations and diplomatic history at Kobe University in Japan. He is a 4th-generation Japanese-American who combines expertise on US and Japanese history with writing and commenting on current affairs. Professor Minohara will start with a PowerPoint presentation that outlines his view on the developments in the Asian Pacific area. And then we'll have a Q&A, which I'll kick off with 2 or 3 questions of my own, after which you here in the audience will have the opportunity to ask your questions. Now, without further ado, please welcome Professor Minohara.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is a true pleasure to be able to speak to you today. And I also, of course, have to thank the preeminent journalist, Mr. Brill, for the wonderful and kind introduction. It's sort of like being home, because I used to live in the Netherlands. From 2006 to 2007, I did my sabbatical at Leiden University. So the moment I got off at the Schiphol airport, it really felt like home. And I'm only here for 3 weeks this time around, but Japan requires a quarantine, so it's actually, I have a fun-filled 2 weeks to be by myself when I get back. But without further ado, so this title is interesting because I did not think of this title. It was decided by the Atlantic Commission, or perhaps it was Giles and RIAS. But I actually published a book several years ago with the same title, just without Asian, A Tumultuous Decade. And the book dealt with the 1930s. So, and we know how that ended up. So I think it really, in a way, it really raises our eyebrows as to where we're headed. And if I were to have a choice in editing, I would take out the Asian, because in this world now, we're all connected. And what happens in Asia, if it's drastic, will have global ramifications. And I believe the Netherlands will be impacted too. So I think we can omit the Asian, and it's just a tumultuous decade. And of course, we are talking about the rise of China. And it's really interesting how the world has changed. When I was in Leiden, this is going back to 2006, 2007, I took the opportunity to give a lot of talks all over Europe. Of course, it was my excuse to also see Europe. And I remember vividly, I was invited by this institution in Copenhagen in Denmark. And so this must have been probably spring 2007. And I gave my talk about how I have never seen a rise of a power that rose peacefully. That there were always going to be changes in the global system, And most times that would lead to frictions, with a very few exceptions. And my Chinese counterpart, an academic, a gorgeous lady, and I knew I had lost from that moment. From the very beginning, I was at a disadvantage, but she talked about the peaceful rise. And she talked about how China will be, understands democracy, appreciates democracy, how human rights was very important. And to me, it was like, oh my gosh, you're not believing a single thing that you're saying. But the audience saw me as this, what do you call it, this dragon slayer, that I was a xenophobe, and they really sided with her. And to me, it was very interesting how the world has really, really turned. And in many ways, I think a lot of experts are perhaps to take a position that is perhaps more severe than myself when it comes to China. Because as a realist, I don't sway too much, but I just see the facts and state how I believe things are. And so with that in mind, I think we need to assess the world as it stands today. And to peer into the future. Because, coming to the Netherlands, no one wears a mask, right? Which to me was very bizarre because in Japan, everybody still wears a mask. So I felt really naked when I got off the airplane and people aren't wearing masks. But we are, I believe, approaching the end. And so what's in store for us in this post-pandemic world? And could there be a clash of giants? Now, before I talk about China and its global ramifications, I think it's really important to look at the other protagonists, and that is the United States. And if I understand correctly, I think this week there's going to be another talk at the Atlantic Commission about the divided United States. 2 weeks, okay, I'm sorry, 2 weeks. And that is, I completely, I'm on the same page with whoever's giving that talk because, even though I have not been to the United States since COVID, I have friends and we talk on the phone all the time. And what I see is the United States in which the political divide is getting greater and greater and greater. Because when you have, like for example, my best friend from high school, he no longer talks to his father because his father loves Trump. Or I have friends who don't talk to their siblings because they are anti-vaccine. And this is really strange. I have never seen a situation where families are torn apart by politics. And I think this will have, this division in the United States will increase further. There's nothing in sight which indicates to me that this division will be repaired. And there are other things that worry me. This redistricting that's taking place in certain states after the 2020 census, suppression of voter rights, and now you have this debate of pro-life versus pro-choice, with the Supreme Court being political, I think. When you have the three latest conservatives who were appointed standing alongside Mitch McConnell, that raises a lot of eyebrows. And I think these all have serious repercussions. And because of this political divide, I think the very nature of American politics is to look more inwards rather than outwards. And with that in mind, I'm not going to elaborate further, but so what is Biden's foreign policy? And I think, and I'm sure I'm going to get pushback on this, but I think it's a continuation of America First, without using that term. Okay, it has a friendlier facade. But essentially, it's America First. And it's his Buy America policy, and all his policies are about America becoming better. Okay, not necessarily the allies and the countries with that like-minded countries being better altogether. It's not enlightened self-interest. It's more about narrow American self-interest. And because of this division, his instincts start to look inwards. Of course, we have midterms coming up next year. And the external battles. And he said this himself in his speech. He says his battles after Afghanistan. He says America is no longer fighting external wars, but now the battles are with climate change and COVID. And if that's true, if these two things are his battles, then these are issues that require the cooperation of China. So, and if he wants to be victorious, if he wants to succeed in overcoming climate change and in COVID, then it's not in his mandate to increase tensions with China. Right? So I think for him, it's more of status quo. So I'm sort of worried about a kumbaya president. Hold China's hands, slap them when they're misbehaving, but generally to get along. And another thing that we need to keep in mind is because of the midterms that are approaching, Biden cannot afford to further escalate a trade war. Because I think especially he needs the Midwest. He needs the support of the farmers there, and the world is not going to buy all that grain. It's going to be China. And also, he doesn't want to inflict pain on China any further because he doesn't want to suffer the consequences of China's, the quid pro quo. And also, when you look at American companies, I mean, they still value China, not just for the production base, but also for the market. All right, so, I mean, just recently, Rawlings, that baseball equipment maker, it closed its last factory in the United States, and will be building a new factory in China. And a lot of these American financial companies, they made tons of money in Hong Kong, and they still make lots of money in China. And so, from a business perspective, they don't want to see Biden push China hard on economic issues. So, because of course they have in mind reprisals, which is always bad for business. There are certain areas that Biden is pushing back. Certain Chinese businesses, like a good example is Huawei. There's been pushback by the Biden administration, which was a continuation of Trump's policies in the area of technology, of course, and human rights. And this is perhaps a marked difference from the previous president who really didn't care about human rights. And so I think Biden will seek to cooperate with China on issues where he can. And I think the recent Meng Wanzhou deal clearly shows this approach, where he's willing to cut deals. And so this is going to sound a little harsh, but I'm thinking as a historian, perhaps Biden may become the Chamberlain of our times. Now, on the other hand, China is a much different animal. It's led by an ambitious leader, and he's the dictator. We need to face that fact. And when we live in democracies, we really, I think, have trouble understanding the mentality of dictators. I mean, these guys don't rule by being nice or friendly, okay? And they're ambitious. And in case of Xi Jinping, I'm not going to go into his personal profile, but he wants to be the greatest Communist Party leader ever. In order to do this, he needs to surpass Mao. And where did Mao fail? Well, he failed in reunifying Taiwan. And of course, that's because of the Korean War. So I think she sees his work cut out for him. All right. And another thing, the rising power, okay, the power that's challenging the existing hegemon can only win by altering the status quo. So it doesn't win by being in neutral or stepping on the brakes. It only wins by stepping on the gas pedal. And so time does not necessarily favor China. And there are two things that we need to keep in mind. The Chinese demographics are horrible. Okay, the one-child policy and whatnot, when China is aging very quickly. And of course, Xi Jinping, although he's a dictator, as far as I know, he's a human being, so he'll only live so long. And so he'll want to change, so Mao lived, to 82, was it? I mean, he's going to want to see change while he's still healthy. Okay, and once you start to get frail, things get kind of, dangerous. So he probably wants to see change before he's 80. Probably in his mid-70s is more ideal. And he's 68 now. So I think that China will act decisively sooner rather than later. So we should stop kidding ourselves and believing this fallacy that China will understand us, that China appreciates peace too. I think it appreciates peace on its own terms. Okay, so. But that being said, am I forecasting some kind of disaster next year? No, I think China's a smart power. There are very intelligent people advising Xi Jinping on his foreign policy. And so China will remain conciliatory until after the 20th Party Congress and the Beijing Winter Olympics of next year, because it wants to be successful. So after 2023 is where things will start to get dicey. And so here I'm being kind of conservative. I'm saying before he reaches 80, but I think in my mind, something will most likely happen in this decade. And of course, there are lots of caveats, who knows, something could happen to him. I don't have a crystal ball, but I would be very surprised if we come out of this unscathed. Because when you historically look at major power rivalries, they usually end in major conflict. The only exception that I can see in the past century or two is the Anglo-US. And that is an oddball when it comes to history, when powers hold hand in hand and share become joint holders of the global order for a time being. That's not going to happen with China and the United States. Okay, so now let's cut to the chase. So Japan, where does Japan sit in all of this? Well, it's the third largest economy. Okay, even despite 30 years of deflation, and it's been pretty much, when I read The Economist, I mean, there's maybe an occasional small article about Japan, but it still exists, okay? But its population is aging. Today, this past 2.5 weeks, I was in Middleburg, which is not like The Hague. It's much smaller, more quaint. But I think generally the population I saw a lot of young people. Where in Japan, if you go to a quaint village, you don't see any children at all. It's all about people in their 70s, 80s. I mean, I see homes that are just disappearing into the dirt. And then this is a serious problem. And Japan is shrinking because of the low birth rate. I just checked just a couple weeks ago. In the past 5 years, Japan's population has shrunk by 860,000. So that's a large-sized city, right? And that's not good for the country. And the economy has been hit hard by the pandemic. So that Japan's leaders are hoping that the Chinese will offer this miracle, that it'll help Japan from the current malaise. This is for the tourists, exports, production. I mean, China seems to be the solution for all of Japan's economic problems. So Japan is utterly relying on China for its economic recovery, and you could probably argue its economic viability. But on the other hand, and this is a paradox that Japan has, and perhaps other countries do too, is that Japan is dependent on the United States for its national security. So up until probably about 10 years ago, Japanese foreign policy was basically easy. Manage the United States. Okay, manage US-Japan relations because, economically, the United States was the most important trading partner, and then security, you were dependent on the United States. But over this past decade, you have China as your economic protector, and then you have the United States as your national security protector. So how do you make sense of these two contrasting the situation? So Japan's instinct naturally is to place itself between the two countries. And you can call it balancing, you can call it hedging. And it's come to the point where, and I know people from the Japanese mission are here, but there are some very senior diplomats in Japan who say, Japan's role should be to be in the middle, act as a mediator, okay, and make sure these two countries don't fight. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, all of a sudden, what, Japan can mediate between these two countries? Oh my gosh, right? And I think it's very, very silly. And there are other more senior diplomats that I speak to in Japan, former ambassadors to the United States, and they're saying, that's a ridiculous proposition. How can a country that has an alliance with the United States act as a mediator in the first place? All right, and it's also overestimating Japan's ability to negotiate, because it really cannot, because Japan is a country that does not fulfill its own security needs, right? If you're utterly dependent on one country for security, how can you play this position as a mediator? So I don't think that's very realistic. But you still see Japan hoping for this to be some kind of policy. So you have Japan joining RCEP, and then you have Japan, betting on Quad. And Quad is really hard to figure out. I see it as a marshmallow. You can bend it any way you want. And Japan is hoping that peace will persevere. So in that regard, I think Biden's, I call it the soft, hard approach, is welcomed by Japan, as it allows it from making the hard decisions, and that is taking sides on this issue. Now, the problem of being in the middle is this is probably universal, is that it's never a solution, and it cannot be sustained, because the situation always changes. And I think the time will arrive that a younger, this is probably a key word, future US president will realize the true danger of China and seize upon what I call the Churchillian moment by standing up to China. And this is not just to preserve democracy, human rights, it's most importantly to preserve American primacy. And I think that's in the American DNA from the point that America was formed. I'm hoping that still exists. And this is when Japan, and also the West, which would definitely include the Netherlands, is forced to choose sides. Because right now we're still being wishy-washy. And this will, in Japan's case, will become the impetus for it to break away from the past of embracing defeat. And yes, Japan is a country that's still, I think, to a large degree impacted by what happened in the 1930s and the consequences of that. And it's interesting because just last week, I gave a talk for the Konrad Adenauer Association and Foundation, and there are a lot of Southeast Asian experts, and I don't know if they're pro-Chinese or what, but they were actually saying that Japan playing a greater role in Southeast Asia can be dangerous because of what happened in the 1930s. And I said to them, oh my gosh, what did you smoke before? I didn't say that, but that was in my mind because that is just outrageous. I think the problem is not Japan acting imperialistic again, it's Japan not doing anything is the greatest danger. All right? So I think we really need to be cognizant of, of what we're facing today and not look back too bad or to learn the wrong lessons of the past. Now, Japan does not belong to a regional political grouping such as the EU. It also is not part of NATO. There is no NATO in Asia, as you know. I think what Japan needs to do is to bolster links with these two organizations. But the problem with EU and NATO is that they're large and they're not monolithic. And ASEAN too. It's not, people like to talk about ASEAN centrality and want ASEAN, but that's a myth. Okay, so when you rub your eyes, I see a lot of EU countries, I see a lot of NATO member states. And there are some people in the US military, some of my friends are very senior generals and admirals, and they say NATO, to a large degree, is a political organization rather than a military organization. I think those are harsh words, probably reflects their frustration that they encountered when they were stationed in Europe. So I think that Japan should not engage EU and NATO as this organization, but rather look at the individual member states. And I think what's important is that Japan links closer with the maritime powers of Europe. And these would, of course, the Netherlands sent their frigate to Japan, so that would definitely include the Dutch, but also the Germans, the French, Britain for sure, right? These, I think, the major power. Some would include Spain, but I'm not an expert on Spain, and I don't know where they stand and their views towards the Indo-Pacific. But in the end, it's up to Japan's leaders to make a decisive move. But this is not characteristic of most Japanese prime ministers, and definitely not the characteristic of Prime Minister Kishida. Okay, he's probably, he's a good choice for Japan now because Suga was terrible. And after a very weak, ineffective leader, even, I call him, and Giles will recall, I call him a pizza crust with no sauce, no cheese, just a crust, He's just so plain and simple. But because after you have a moldy pizza, a pizza with no sauce is appealing, right? And that's, I'm being very harsh, but no, I have no expectations of Kishida. But that was Japan's choice. Okay, this is my last slide, and I know I'm going close to 20 minutes. So how does Japan need to respond? Ideally, a Japan-ROK US alliance is key. But as you know, relations with between Korea and Japan are not very good. And unless something drastic happens in elections next year in Korea, I don't think this is likely to change. So then what else can Japan do? Well, strengthening the military intelligence links with Australia and the United Kingdom becomes vital. And I think in a way, this is sort of a backdoor entry to Five Eyes. And I think that AUKUS can be a goal. And I've spoken to a lot of experts, and these are former admirals. I have my think tank, one of the advisors is the former chief of staff of the Navy. And he says, Japan can make nuclear-powered submarines, no problem. There are issues of what to do with the spent fuel, and there's, of course, the public opinion that's against such weaponry. But, these are game changers. And I think Japan should really look into the possibility of doing this. I also fear that because nuclear submarines are such an awesome weapon, and like I said, they're game changers, but the Australians are not going to get their first submarines, 10 years from now? So if I were Chinese, I would act before the Australians get these submarines. So in a way, I think this action sort of starts the clock, the countdown. And when you think about it, and you look at the American Columbia class, you look at the B-21 Raider, these are going to all be produced. It takes 10 years at least, right? And so in a way, and I'm a historian of World War II, I know that when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, the first two B-19s had rolled out, not B-20, the B-29s. America was not ready. And I think we could be in a similar situation where something happens and we're flat-footed, we're not ready for this contingency. And so increased links with maritime NATO, I'm going back to what I said earlier, procuring more from Europe. And of course, when I speak to the Japanese military, they always gripe about this. When you procure from Europe, everything's different, manuals are different, tools are different, it becomes expensive. But I think linking more with Europe is critical, because in times of crises, you can't not just deal with just dealing with the United States is not enough. So interoperability is, I think, a key word. And this is another thing that I've been entertaining. NATO is now increasingly more interesting, or there's a slant towards the Indo-Pacific, but NATO, is it just about the North Atlantic? And so I'm thinking, how about the Nuclear Arsenal Treaty Organization, NATO? And maybe, even in French, maybe the acronym remains the same. Okay, and why is it the Nuclear Arsenal Treaty Organization? Because the awesome part about NATO is in times of total war that NATO members has. For example, Germany. Their fighters are equipped to carry American nuclear weapons. And that's an enormous deterrence. And this is something that Japan, that right now the hurdle is very high. But why can't Japanese fighters in times of a total war be able to carry American nuclear weapons? And again, this is not something that's feasible at this moment. But when the international situation changes, I think anything is possible. So I think Japan should more examine the German model of being able to deliver American nuclear weapons. And the fact that we're talking about nuclear weapons is a scary thought. But again, I think things are going to get worse before they get better. It's like a Star Wars movie. In the end, good prevails, hopefully. But it could get nasty in between. Okay, so the two things, these are my two final points. I don't know how much you know about Japan, but Japan is a very interesting nation. I think it's an oddball when it comes to security issues. And maybe it's because Japan is very safe internally. Like, when you see Japanese men, young men, they have their wallets half sticking out because nobody will take it, right? But in Europe, maybe not the Netherlands, but I know for sure in Italy, that'll be gone in like 5 seconds. So there's no sense of being able to, you have to protect yourself. And that's the Japanese security identity. It's being a security receiver. America provides. But is that the correct identity to have when you're the third largest economy in the world and your neighbor is increasingly belligerent? I don't think so. So I think Japan needs to gradually shift its security identity to that of a security provider. And this would include, and I don't mean that Japan will be sending troops to the Middle East. No, nothing like that. But at least in the surrounding waters, Japan will provide security to like-minded countries. And of course, this would include Taiwan. And so it's critically important. And the Japanese now, they love slogans. So now the really popular slogan is, Taiwan's war is Japan's war. But it's just a slogan because Japan's not doing anything to prepare for a contingency like that. And another thing that really irks me when I'm in Japan is that even though Japan is a major power, it sees itself as a middle power. This is an ongoing theme, that Japan is like a Canada or maybe a New Zealand. And you think, what? If Japan were in Europe, it'd be much larger than Germany, right? It'd be a major force in European politics. But the Japanese do not have this mentality. They like to see themselves as being very, very small, not important, which is, again, bizarre. So I think it starts to see itself as a major power with major responsibilities, and it needs to act like a major power in the security domain. And this will, of course, require constitutional revision. And this is, of course, the ultimate thing that no leader in Japan has been able to do. Kishi in 1960 revised the alliance. That was a big step. I was hoping that his grandson would finally revise the constitution. He took baby steps, but ultimately it was unsuccessful. Suga, of course, can't do it. Kishida won't do it. So then that is the situation that we're at. And Japan, historically, is not proactive by nature. And I think all democracies in general tend to be slow in reacting to change. So in a way, I think it's the actions of China which will lead to the Great Awakening. And I also think it's China that will, at least momentarily, solve America's division. You know how America tends to be united when there's a major conflict abroad. But it's China is what will, in a very twisted way, change Japan and perhaps make America better. Now, this clash, of course, won't be premeditated. I don't think Xi Jinping is a crazy leader. He doesn't want to go out there and to rule the world. He wants to create a sphere of influence. He wants the United States to stay out of this sphere. But I think miscalculations can arise. And then that's where we go to the 1930s analogies. There are a lot of miscalculations on part of Japan, part of Germany, and similar things can happen. And what I'm worried about, and this I guess goes to your talk just a couple of days ago on Afghanistan, is that I'm afraid that Chinese leaders or decision makers will perceive the way America left Afghanistan as American weakness. And this could have subtle ripple effects on how policies are made in China. And it's not just China, right? We need to also look at Iran, North Korea. I mean, these could be areas that could sort of spiral out of control and involve the United States and China in a major conflict. Now, finally, before I conclude, so if we learn from the 1930s, if Hong Kong is Sudetenland, and I really think there are a lot of parallels here, are we prepared for the Poland of our times? And this Poland will definitely be Taiwan. Now, there are so many similarities. I mean, there were no French-British troops on Polish soil. Hitler made the calculation that these powers will not defend Poland, which was, he was very wrong. If Xi Jinping makes a calculation that Taiwan, the United States will not defend Taiwan, yeah, of course, he'll go after it. I mean, he wants to do it peacefully, but if he can't, he'll use military might to change the realities. And he's already succeeded in doing that in the South China Sea. Now, South China Sea, we're complaining, but he changed the facts on the ground. Hong Kong, victorious again. So what's there to stop them? I mean, the West has really, we've condemned their actions, but that's it, right? So I like to say that things are going to get better soon, but they're not, because again, as American dominance wanes, it's only natural that global instability will further increase. So, after COVID, we're hoping for a great world, that we can travel again, be back to normal. But unfortunately, I think there's lots of despair and troubled times that awaits us. And so I wanted to end on a upbeat note, but I can't, because that's not how I perceive international relations at this moment. And I went a little bit more than I had planned to, but I'd like to have a nice discussion afterwards. So thank you very much. Okay, so I should go up there? Okay, sure.
Okay. All right. Make sure that your wallet is not sticking out.
Yeah, mine's in, because, yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your presentation. That is both illuminating and sobering. You described a situation in which there is a US president that wants to avoid a direct confrontation.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, there is an ambitious dictator that wants to alter the existing order.
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
What does that mean for Taiwan? Does that mean that you think that the situation will certainly polarize within 2 years?
I'm not going to put a number to it, because I really don't know. But it will come, I think, and Taiwan will be it. I wonder if you've noticed that Biden's arms sales to Taiwan are not that significant when it comes to what he's selling, and also the amount that he's selling. And so that's interesting. I think Biden is trading very cautiously. But I think Taiwan will be sort of like the Philippines in the 1930s when Japan made its advance. I mean, it's just not defensible, I think. And the situation will get worse as we wait. So I think China will be stronger in 2 years' time than it is now. Of course, there's going to be an apex, and it's going to start to wane, and therefore it needs to act eventually, and that has to be this decade, in my mind.
Yeah. Now, I've seen already articles by American experts who say Taiwan is actually not a vital American national interest. Do you think that the public opinion, or let's say the opinion in Washington, is already changing as far as Taiwan is concerned? I mean, 10 years ago, there would be no question about it.
No, I think there are voices like that. I know fellow scholars who believe that there's no reason for the United States to defend Taiwan. But I just think those claims are outrageous. Of course, Taiwan is important. You just look on the map. It's, it's part of that island chain. If Taiwan is annexed by China, it really changes the reality in Japan and also the Philippines. I mean, it's just, it would really to be the detriment to the United States too.
Yeah.
And also, if America is not going to defend a democracy, then is there any meaning of other alliances? I mean, what does the US-Japan alliance mean in that case? So, but that is a calculation that China might make, saying that Americans are not going to shed blood.
They don't really care.
Yeah. But I think that's a misjudgment, or at least I hope.
Okay. And how about Japan? I mean, what would Japan do if Xi Jinping turns up the heat in Taiwan, around Taiwan?
Oh, Japan will send their moral support. Probably send, will probably maybe help by providing, cash or whatnot, but it won't be military. It can't. So, and that's the sad part. And I always question my fellow Japanese colleagues if there is a moral responsibility of Japan because of the colonial period for Japan to protect Taiwan. Because when you think about it, there were many Taiwanese who shed blood under the imperial flag, right? They fought as Japanese and they died as Japanese. So what does that mean in the Japanese historical legacy? Shouldn't Japan do something about that? And it's interesting, nobody gives me a straight answer. They're just quiet.
Yeah. And how would neighboring countries react to a more active Japanese policy? I mean, I'm trying to think of a...
Well, the Koreans are probably popping in my mind. They'll probably don't like it.
Of course, in Europe, for a long time, we didn't want Germany to play a very powerful role.
Yes.
And now we are ready to accept a very active and leading German role in European politics. How is that in East Asia?
I believe Japan is not at that stage yet. And it's not, a lot of people make comparisons like, oh, Japan hasn't apologized about its past and what. It's not that easy because, Japan's case was very messy. There was no Adolf Hitler, right? You had competing institutions that really made these decisions that weren't really unified. The Army did its thing, the Navy did its thing. So it's really hard to be responsible, in that as a state. And then with the atomic bombs, Japan became a victim of the war too. So it's very hard to be a victim and have this mentality that you did wrong, in mentality-wise.
Yeah.
So it's very confusing.
Yeah.
But that being said, we need to look at the realities. What can the Japanese military do? And I'm not talking about the legal parameters. I mean, Japan is very much restricted. I mean, Japan's military is not a military by domestic law. It is a military by international law. Isn't this paradox? It's very strange, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, and I hate to say this in front of, there's a colonel representing the Japanese military here, but I think the Japanese military is well-trained, highly motivated, but it has never seen any actual combat. And how will such a military function? There's no reserves. It's not very, the outlook doesn't look very promising.
Yeah.
Yeah, and recently I had a friend of mine who he's a colonel too. He took 300 troops to the United States to train in California, National Training Center. He took 10 tanks. Within 3 minutes, he lost 8 tanks. And he was very blunt. He says, we just did not know how to fight. He says, I panicked. It was chaos. My men were dying left and right, and I just froze. But after that 3-month training, then he learned how to fight. But it's different. And this is a training, but what happens in real combat?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm really worried about these things.
Yeah. I'd like to take a step back and ask you a more general question. There was an article a provocative article in Foreign Policy, you may have seen it, And it argued that it's not China's rise that is the problem, but the fact that the country has already peaked and is facing a slow decline.
China is.
Yeah, China is.
Okay.
Because it will have tremendous problems in the near future.
Yeah, I alluded to that.
Yeah. Do you agree with that?
Not in the short term. I think China is growing despite COVID. It pulled out, it's first in, first out, it's growing, and other economies are not. So I would say that China is, relatively speaking, stronger and in a better state than we are. And the thing with China is because it's a nation that's trying to catch up, its weaponry is state-of-the-art. Where lots of the weaponry that we have in the United States and probably NATO too, we need to, it's like really old stuff, right? A lot of the stuff, it needs to be updated, but it's expensive, and we sort of, pushed it down the road. And I think when we look at it from that perspective, I think China has advantage. Right. And beyond 10 years, then things could change. But then again, Xi Jinping wins by changing the status quo. He doesn't win by, sitting back and just enjoying the world pass by, right? So, yeah.
All right. Before I turn to the audience, my final question is, the economist wrote, only very occasionally we can see the tectonic plates of geopolitics shifting in front of our eyes. And of course, that was in relation to AUKUS.
Yeah.
The magazine compares the foundation of AUKUS with the fall of the Berlin Wall. Is that indeed such a far-reaching development?
I would not go that far. It's not as obvious. And where the fall of the Berlin Wall was, it was visually obvious. But I think it has far-reaching implications. But there are also a lot of questions to be asked. One is that for the submarines, once they're operational, will they be allowed to enter Japanese bases? Because, with nuclear power, you could be underwater forever, but these men need to eat. You need water, right? They need to be resupplied. Do they go back to Australia each time? It makes sense to if they want to operate in your South China Sea, to be able to go into Sasebo, or Japanese ports as well. How's that going to work? But the problem with AUKUS is that the changes are a decade, if not more, down the line. Because the intelligence part, that already exists, all right? So I think it was more of a message to China, rather than the actual military aspects.
And is the intelligence sharing substantial enough?
Well, you have the Five Eyes already, right? And I think these three countries are the closest. So I deal a lot with the Japanese military. I actually lecture to the Japanese, their officer school, and what's interesting, I get a lot of bickering from Japanese, especially naval officers, who complain to me of how their American counterparts do not show them certain secrets, which the Australians can see. Like there are certain buildings that we cannot go in. And this is the US-Japan alliance. And I counter by saying, well, Australia has paid the ultimate price for the United States. It has shed blood. It has fought every post-World War II war alongside the United States, including Vietnam. Japan has shed zero blood. So I think that America appreciates the alliance, and Japan is a very, very good friend, but Australia is a brother.
Yeah.
And of course you're closer with your brother. So unless Japan makes that ultimate, Japan, not even in UN-led missions has Japan suffered any casualties. Even the Dutch have lost people in Iraq and Afghanistan, right? And the Netherlands is a much smaller country. So this zero across the board for Japan, casualty-wise, is an anomaly. And if you don't change that, and how are you going to be trusted to the level of Australia? So these are the realities, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm now turning to the audience. Who would like to ask a question? And I'm also urging you to ask a question and not make a statement. And besides that, state your name and organization.
Yeah. Okay.
There is a microphone. Is there a microphone? Yes, there is a microphone.
Okay, sorry. My name is Jan van Bentem,
Yes.
Dagblad. I would like to follow up about this aging of China. I spoke a few years ago with the Chinese military attaché here in the Netherlands, and he said, he was looking at the future. He said, our problem is 4-2-1. 4 grandparents have 2 children who have 1 grandchild. If we want to win our position in the world, we need to do it fast. How fast do you think?
Oh, you mean China?
Yeah.
Well, that depends on a lot of factors. So again, I'm not going to predict the future, but I think in many ways it's going to happen. It's inevitable is the word I'd like to use, which sounds kind of crazy, but I just don't see any other way out of this because China is not going to back down. The United States is not going to accept Chinese primacy. So what do you do? So, again, it's, and China has legitimate grievances, right? I mean, and not so legitimate grievances. But it sort of overlaps with the grievances that Japan and Germany and Italy had, which led to the tripartite agreement. I mean, why does Britain, the United States, all these other, these group one of the countries that were successful in creating a modern nation state, why do they make the rules? And those, and these 3 countries became modern nation states around the same time, late 1860s, early 1870s. They were the second pack. And by the time they were strong enough, the rules were already established. So, of course, you have a lot of grievances. And of course, in Germany's case, you had World War I. Japan's case, you had a lot of other, racism was another grievance that Japan had. They were never treated as an equal. So then you want to challenge the order so that it suits your national interests. And I think China, is unhappy. It has the way it understands history. It sees itself as a victim. And, and it is a great power. And if you're great, by the very definition of great power, you change the rules, right? Britain did it. Spain did it. And that's why I think, there is no such thing as a great power that stands, meekly by and doesn't do anything. And so I think it's this new mentality that is driving China. And another thing that I forgot to say is, I was just reading this book about how history is taught in the United States, and it's pretty bad. In schools, in high school, in college, no one studies history anymore, right? History is just reading old stuff, and it's no fun. And people like to do international relations, political science, all this theoretical stuff. And I'm wondering what the trickle effect of this will be. A country that does not understand history versus a country that creates its own history, to its own use. That's a bad chemistry. And that really, in my mind, makes the prospects for a peaceful resolution even dimmer. Because these are 2 countries that really don't understand history, unfortunately.
Okay.
Yeah.
Who else? Over there.
There are a lot of hands.
My name is Hugo van der Heijden. I'm a student with the Delft University of Technology. Okay. Thank you for your talk. You prescribe, on the one hand, that Japan should take a different role in terms of a military might, and on the other hand, that it is facing challenges on the economic side. And in those 2 respects, the decline in the population feels like a problem that is felt for both your vision of the military future and the economic future. Could you maybe set out some pathways that could solve this problem and maybe go into immigration as a solution for this for Japan?
That's you hit it on the nail. That's it. The solution is immigration, but that's the ugly I word if you're a Japanese conservative. I'm for immigration. I believe in diversity, but every time I say that to a group of Japanese conservatives, they go nuts about that. Because being Japanese is something special. So if you were born in Japan and you look the way that you do, and you speak Japanese and no Dutch, people won't accept you as being Japanese because you don't look Japanese. My students they look Japanese, where when I lecture in Europe and in North America, it's diverse, right? And this is something that needs to change. And you're right, it's only immigration that will solve Japan's problems, to create people with a new identity. They don't look Japanese. For example, the NBA player, Rui Hachimura, he's a black Japanese. But his identity is Japanese, and we need to accept it as that. But I think the Olympics really showcased that. And there were a lot of Japanese who didn't look traditionally Japanese, and they did really well. I'm hoping that the public opinion towards this will change, and eventually that Japan's society will change too. Now the military, they don't have enough people. Their quotas are not being filled. And they seriously considered bringing in not immigrants, but those, for example, pathway to citizenship by serving, or having people with dual citizens become, and it's just, and it's the people in their 50s who want change, but the older people don't. And there's lots of pushback, and I was told that plan was shelved. So the Japanese military is still understaffed, undermanned. And it's a thing. It's something that won't change, and that is just a shame. And the reason why is because politicians don't want to pay the costs at polls, right? And Japan going down the line is perhaps 10, 20 years down the line. The next election is just a few years, right? And so the measuring stick that they use is much shorter, So they're not looking at the future of Japan, but they're looking at their own personal futures as a politician. And it's this mismatch, I think, that sometimes weakens democracies. Yeah, so that's, yeah.
Okay, who else? Over here.
Thank you very much. My name is Jordi Klein. I'm working at the Dutch MOD, just opposite the road. You had some challenging things you said and also put on your PowerPoint. And one was that about the Chamberlain moment for the United States, that they were reacting like.
Well, I said Biden.
Well, yeah. But Biden. But I would like to challenge you that if you think that Japan should act like you propose she should do, then what do you think? At least then how the US should act? Because at the moment the US is seen by many nations, also I think Japan and the Netherlands, as already being quite hawkish against China. So now if you step up Japan, like a very level higher, then how should the United States react, and also how should Europe react?
Yeah.
Because then we become, does Europe also needs to step up? Yeah. Or do we really become like the kitten to play with by China?
I think that's a very good question. I think that Europe, not every country in Europe should step up, but at least the maritime powers definitely should step up. I think there has to be some kind of linking of the maritime powers. And with this, I'd also include countries in Southeast Asia. The maritime powers have a lot of problems with China, but the landlocked countries don't. I mean, they see China as their friend. And I think with Europe, you have countries that aren't so worried about China, but other countries who really see a distant threat. So I think there can be some kind of grouping, an informal grouping, and especially this will be mostly Navy and probably to a lesser degree the Air Force. Should definitely exchange ideas. And this is, I think, can be done very easily. I don't know if you're...
So which European countries are you thinking of?
I'm thinking about Britain for sure, and then Germany, and then France. And if the Dutch are interested, of course. But it's expensive, right? Maritime power, I mean, because as you know, possessing a Navy and maintaining a Navy is just very expensive. Only wealthy countries could do that. And then sending your ships all the way out to the Pacific, and that's lots of work. So, and then Japan, I think if Japan steps up its game, I think the United States will appreciate that. They will see the alliance as being mutual. Not the United States being the caregiver, but if Japan plays a more important role, then I think the Americans will value this alliance continuing. Whether if Japan is just a free rider, then the American hesitance to discarding the alliance won't be as high. You see what I'm saying? So yes, I think it further cements the alliance. Japan does more.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
My follow-on question would then be, right, what kind of status quo then do you foresee? So if this would all happen, as you just described, and you still got China as the rising hegemon, which you stated, right, they want to change the status quo into their favor. Yeah. So now you've got this pushback, this deterrence, this actual military deterrence, and by other means. So what kind of world then do you see when Xi Jinping is 80?
Well, I'm saying that we should prepare for this, but I also know, I'm a realist too, that we're not going to change. And we democracies will only change when we're forced to change, right? And when that moment comes where we wake up one morning and we watch the news and it's like, oh my gosh, right, is the moment that will change. We all talk the talk, and we're very good at that. But when it's walking the walk, that's expensive and all these hurdles that need to be overcome, we just don't do it, right? So it's important that we're talking about this, but all the things that I say, and these things are not going to happen, right? Unless something happens, an external, event that sort of wakes us up, is how I see it. And that's just, it's unfortunate, but that's how it's going to be. Yeah.
Okay. Well.
Yeah.
Okay. Who else? And let me urge non-man to ask a question as well.
Non-man?
I think over there. I'm just woke.
Yeah, okay.
Yes, please.
Yes, my name is Doreen van Noren. I'm
a little bit louder, please.
My name is Doreen van Noren. I'm from the Dutch Foreign Ministry.
Okay. Yes.
I'm wondering whether we're not focusing too much on conventional military strategies, and whether the war is not more in economic innovation, artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, and to what extent it wouldn't be more attractive for Japan if China would invest heavily in their economy and they would just gradually grow closer, because China doesn't have any plans of occupation of Japan. I mean, there is an issue with Taiwan because it's an historic issue and an outcome of the Second World War. And in the same way, Japan's position and dependence on the West is also an outcome of the Second World War. So wouldn't there also be sort of an emancipation possible of Japan wanting to liberate itself a little bit from the embrace from the West?
So in my 60-minute version, I talk about that. I talk about how historically, you dominate through trade, and then that wealth, like the VOC did, that wealth you invest in military technology, and that makes you a stronger nation. That's how you start to dominate, and technology is very key. And the AI, 5G, that's critical. But I think we were really snoozing, and China is a lot more advanced in all these technologies. I just read this morning that China will be exporting 10,000 electric trucks to Japan, because Japan doesn't have any companies that can make an electric truck. And you're right, Japan should be seriously thinking about how to, sever the supply chains with China. But again, companies don't want to make that decision because it costs money and you lose profits, right? And with the pandemic, people are suffering already. And so it's very hard to make those decisions. I speak to a lot of businessmen, and they want further ties with China because they're after profits. They want to make their stockholders happy. And they don't understand the fate of your nation is very much tied to the fate of your company. They don't see it that way. It's the short-term gains. And that's why a lot of Japanese firms profit heavily in Hong Kong, and they love it. I was just speaking to a person from a very major Japanese, the largest trading firm in Japan, and he says, I love it in Hong Kong. He goes, who cares about democracy? We're making profits here. But it's that attitude that we have. And I'm sure it's not a Japanese thing. A lot of businessmen, capitalism is about making money, and that takes priority over human rights, over democracy in some instances. Now, I really respect that you're from foreign ministry, and I think diplomacy is very, very important, and I would never, think less of diplomacy, but I think with China, diplomacy will never solve anything, because China will only use diplomacy to seek its own gains. And if there is a compromise, it is a temporary compromise because China needs to change the status quo, like I've been telling you. And look at the path that China has taken. I mean, we can't kid ourselves. Are things going to get better? No, because China's not finished. So, and we try, 1930s again, the analogy. Diplomacy, we thought that would be it, but it wasn't enough. All right, so I think what's very important is that we prepare for the worst and hope for the best, but we're not preparing for the worst. And when things happen, we're not going to be ready for it. That's my major concern.
Okay. Who else?
Look at all these hands. This is good.
Okay. Over there, please.
Should I stand? Hi, I'm Jonathan London. I'm a professor of political economy here at Leiden University.
Oh, okay.
Enjoyed your talk. I'm really sort of thinking about those questions. The problem is not China's rise or maybe its decline, but of course, what's happening in the U.S., greatest political crisis since the Civil War.
Yeah.
And some real interesting aspects. One of the things I'd like to hear about is your reading of viewpoints on the things that you've been discussing from the field of US politics, where you have this bizarre dynamic going on. Secondly, I thought that you said Taiwan was not really defensible, but then you're talking about it, and what you're calling for is a fairly aggressive nuclear proliferation as seemingly the response.
Yeah.
So those are my two questions.
Okay.
Yeah, so no, I've really thought about that second point that you made. I mean, we don't want nuclear proliferation, but that being said, I mean, we've failed to contain North Korea. I mean, they have nuclear weapons, and Iran is striving very hard to have nuclear weapons. So maybe nuclear weapons in hands of like-minded powers, responsible powers, perhaps is a good thing, is sometimes what I think. And when I say Japan, what I'm saying is it has no realism whatsoever, Japan going nuclear. That's not going to happen. But I'm just talking about the feasibility of Japan being able to carry US nuclear weapons in times of total war. That's it, or at least planning for it. Be able to do that, train with dummies or whatnot. Be able to do it, because when it's a total war, you want to be sure that you win this total war, right? And that's what I'm talking about. And probably 3 years ago, 4 years ago, I would not be talking about this, but I really think that things can get really, really horrific and very worrisome very quickly, and therefore, we need to prepare for these contingencies. And so I'm not for proliferation. I'm definitely not for Japan being nuclear armed itself. Okay, having a nuclear power submarine is another thing. And Taiwan being indefensible, I think several years ago, Taiwan could have done a very good job of defending itself. But now with these, what were those amphibious landing crafts? They look like mini aircraft carriers. I forgot the type, the model. I mean, they got 3 of them, right? And they can carry several thousand troops. I mean, Chinese are not building these amphibious carriers to take over senkakus, right? Because you could do that in a rubber boat with 3 men, right? Because there's nobody there. So, I mean, there's only one purpose to have these ships. In Taiwan, and China's they're going to build more. The Taiwan Straits, I mean, the currents are very fast, but I think if the Chinese think that this is a rapid operation, like a blitzkrieg, then I'm sure they think they can pull it off.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and your first question about American politics, yeah, I mean, it's like I said in the very beginning of my talk. I think it's very, very serious, and I think it weakens the United States. Several years ago, when I had some time, I briefly looked into how these past hegemons started to lose their momentum, lose their power. And of course, you start with Rome, right? And all these great scholars talk about the Roman Empire looking inwards, building walls, like Hadrian's Wall. And I'm thinking, well, there's Trump's wall, and America's very divided and is looking inwards. And it's the same for Spain and most likely for Britain, and weak leaders, populist leaders. So yeah, I'm very worried about that too. And really, I mean, Trump is the ultimate divider. I mean, at one point, Reagan was the divider, right? I mean, it was like a litmus test. But Trump is the ultimate litmus test, and you just don't want to speak with somebody who supports Trump, right? It's that bad. And I've spoken to people in their 70s about this. If things were similar during the Vietnam War, and they say, no, during the Vietnam War, Democrats and Republicans spoke to each other. It was about America, and the divide was more of a generational divide. So you have to go all the way back to the Civil War to see America that's so divided. Okay. But I'm hopeful, because I think in this very ironic, twisted way, I think China will solve America's problems, at least not permanently, but for the short term. Because once there is this greater threat, Americans will come together, and it won't be about Trump. It won't be about pro-life, pro-choice. It'll be about winning. In a way, it's probably like the Spanish-American War, and it was sort of the unifier after the Civil War, is how I see it. But it's very, very serious. Okay.
You mentioned North Korea. A few questions were sent in advance, and one of them is, where will it end with North Korea? And maybe we can turn it around and say, is North Korea an asset or a liability for China?
Oh, for China. I think China honestly hope, no, if in an ideal world, would want to have a North Korea that's a vassal state that will listen to it.
Yeah.
But it's not, right? It has its mind of its own, and therefore, I think the Chinese are worried about that. But they also realize that it's better to have North Korea than a unified unified democratic Korea, is what I think. So it's a buffer, a dangerous buffer. And what will happen to the future of North Korea? I mean, that is a really, really valid question. I was at one point thinking, oh, Kim Jong-un, he's going to kill himself because he's gaining so much weight, then it's going to be a natural death. But last time I saw him, he's losing weight. So I'm like, oh, this guy wants to live, and that's not good news for all of us. But yeah, but I think, for him, it's very easy. It's regime survival. And as long as, we should not push North Korea to the brink. We should not push Iran to the brink. We have to keep focused that these, we shouldn't be picking fights with these countries, because if we do, it only benefits China.
Okay.
Right, yeah.
Another question over here.
Hello, my name is Rad Pothera, and I'm a recent graduate from the Leiden University. Okay. So I really enjoyed your talk today. So my question specifically is based on Japan's relationship with the Quad. Okay. So is Japan really betting on the Quad in the future, considering how they are sort of the architects of the free and open Indo-Pacific?
Yeah.
Is that their way of sort of I mean, you mentioned today that Japan sort of does not have a real military in the sense that other countries do.
Yeah.
So is this where their way of sort of buck passing to the countries in the region that are similarly affected?
Yeah. No, I would China? Not. Yeah. And first of all, it's a military. By all means, it's a military. Yeah. So. I wouldn't call it buck passing. I mean, and the thing that I do not appreciate when I'm in Japan is a lot of Japanese diplomats like to say FOIP was our idea, and I like to say to them, who cares? Who cares? I mean, you got to put some content into it, and put some teeth into it, and that FOIP developed into Quad. And my big question is, what is Quad? How I said it's a marshmallow? I mean, everybody sees Quad in the way that they want to see it. So India sees it in its own definition, and Japan has their own definition, and it's very loose. And I think because Quad was so loose is what made AUKUS necessary. Because and you can't bet anything on Quad. It's not, I don't know if you know about history in Asia before World War II, but there was the ABCD encirclement. The Americans, the British, and the Chinese, and the Dutch encircled Japan and strangled Japan. And that was a commitment to do something about Japan changing the status quo. Quad is not an ABCD encirclement. It's talking about vaccine distributions, and it's talking about, it's not this military strategic component.
Joint military exercises, though.
Yeah, but India, how does India perceive China? It doesn't want to pick a fight with China. And Japan doesn't want to pick a fight either. So, So when you take Japan out and then India out of the equation, then what do you have? You have the United States and Australia. So, so I think FOIP and Quad, it sounds nice, but really there is no meaning to it at this point. And I think we need to give it more definition. And the thing that we need to talk about more is Korea. I think Korea is vitally important. And this bickering over, I think, small things just benefits China. Because Korea is capable, militarily too. And if Japan and Korea can really come together, like France and Germany did, oh my gosh, the synergies, and to be a really potent counterforce to Chinese expansion, I think.
But do you see any signs that this will be happening?
No, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen until maybe next elections, if the conservatives come, but I don't know. Korean politicians, when they're put in a difficult position, always like to use the Japanese card, the anti-Japanese card, because it works wonders. We need to have realists all over, but we just don't. And these populist leaders like to play to public opinion, and the Japan card works really well, but not for the younger generation. That's what gives me hope. When I go to Korea and I speak to the college students, they're very pragmatic. And they realize, and they have none of this anti-Japanese sentiment. It hasn't been passed on. And they realize that these two countries need to work together. And so, but that is not going to happen, within this decade. It's going to take time for these people to be in positions where they can influence policy. So, so that's why I'm pessimistic.
Okay.
Yeah.
One more question from the audience. Yes, please, here.
Hi, my name is Juliette. I work for the Ministry of Defense. And I heard you say we need to prepare for the worst and hope for the best.
Yeah.
But I can imagine that once you start preparing for the worst, this can easily be misread by other actors. So my question is, how do you balance preparing for the worst and avoiding your worst nightmare to actually become true because of miscommunication?
Well, things could be covert, right? It doesn't have to be, you don't have to signal to China unless that's your intent. So you don't have to message China, whatever. I mean, there's lots of secret meetings and, secret operations. So yeah, I think we need to do more of that. More linking together. So from my expertise, what I think Japan could do is, Japan has no military hotline with Taiwan. Why not, right? Active Japanese military personnel cannot meet their active Taiwanese counterparts. Things like that from a Japanese perspective. And these are things that, if you're preparing for the worst, you need to be able to know who your counterpart is. You need to be able to pick up the phone, be able to talk to them. So there's an island called Miyakojima off of Okinawa, and there's a radar site there, and it protects Japan's ADIS. And they tell me things get very messy when the Chinese come in, the Japanese scramble, and the Taiwanese scramble, because the Japanese radar operator can't talk to the Taiwanese fighter pilot. She needs to tell Tokyo to contact Taipei, and Taipei to contact that fighter pilot. And these jets are going very fast, right? So within a couple of minutes, then this jet is long gone. And I guess there were some hairy instances where the Japanese fighter and the Taiwanese fighter are in the same area, and it got really, really, really tense. Not because that they were antagonistic, it's because there could be accidents. And so things like that. And these are very easy things. And you don't need to tell people about this. It can be done. I mean, there's a political hotline between Japan and Taiwan. Most people don't know this, but it makes sense. You don't need to talk about it. So do what you can do, And I think Japan is very, very cautious when it deals with Taiwan. But you can do more than providing vaccines, right? And that's just one thing. And I'm sure you guys can come up with a lot of other things that we can do. And I think lines of communication, and again, knowing who the other side is very, very important.
Okay, yeah. One last question from the audience in the rear there, in the back.
Hi, I'm Jan. I'm also a student at Leiden University. And I was wondering, because I always saw China as, what you also said, like a really smart power, so really calculating the pro and cons of an action. So therefore I was wondering why China took action in Hong Kong so fast. Why tried they to take over, so to say, in Hong Kong so fast, while they also could have waited for 2047, I believe, when the agreement between the UK and China would end.
Was it 2047? Was that the agreement? When was the agreement supposed to terminate?
Sorry? The two countries, one system. Yeah, two systems, one country.
Yeah, when was that supposed to terminate? What was the deal with Britain? I don't remember the date.
I believe that
it was 99 years. Was that some kind of?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the big thing is that, will Xi Jinping be alive? No, he won't be alive, right? Yeah, so I mean... Yes, as you can't, as a dictator, you can't just, like I said, you can't lay back. You got to have change, you got to have momentum, and especially, China is also suffering economically from the pandemic, and there are people who are unhappy, right? And so if you're unhappy, you gotta do something to stoke that nationalism. It's very dangerous because you can't necessarily control nationalism, but didn't Putin pull that off with Crimea? He was going down the polls, and he goes into Crimea, then he's a hero. And so that's another thing. That could be another push factor for China to go into Taiwan when things, economically don't go so well for China, or there's discontent. Then that's the ultimate nationalism card, because I don't know of any Chinese who would not be proud of their country taking over Taiwan, right? Unless and those that are unhappy about that probably don't even live in China anymore. So it's not about the Chinese as a people. It's about China as a nation guided by Xi Jinping. That is what's dangerous. And I think we need to, it's very hard for us to really understand this dictator mentality because we don't live in a dictatorship. And I think countries that have experienced that, like when I go to Eastern Europe, when they look at Hong Kong, I mean, for them, there's a different narrative that overlaps, with what's happening. So when I was in Poland, for example, I mean, these female students, when I talked about Hong Kong and that being over, I mean, they would shed tears. And after class, I'm like, well, does that something that I said that upset you? And she's like, no, it's our history. We've lost our freedom. And I really feel the pain for those Hong Kongers who want democracy. And I talk about this to my Japanese students, and Japan has never really lost their freedom, and there was occupation for 7 years, but there were still free people. And so there's no empathy, and I think there is a disconnect between countries that have experienced dictatorships and those who have not. So we should never underestimate Xi Jinping. Okay, and so I think we should be really, really prepared. And it's not just one thing. It's diplomacy, military, everything. But I think we need to sort of really come together and to be able to communicate more. And the very fact that you're accepting what I'm saying, for me, is a sea change. Now, 10 years ago, and if I were to say what I'm saying, you guys think I'm crazy. What's this guy doing? What was this nuts, right? Because I got that in the past. But, again, I don't have a crystal ball or anything, but what I said more than 10 years ago of the trajectory that China will take has happened. And that gives me sort of confidence into what I see ahead. And that worries me. The fact that I wasn't so far off the mark is what worries me even more. All right. So, but again, when things get bad like this, I think we need to always look back to history. History does not repeat itself, but it definitely has rhymes. I think Mark Twain said that. There are parallels, and we need to pick up on that and make sure, for example, 1939, why were we so flat-footed? The United States wasn't even ready for a major conflict, right? And we want to see ourselves in a similar situation with this, clash with China if it does come, and if it doesn't come, then great, because there's a chance that they may not. There could be something in China domestically, Xi Jinping could, fall off a bridge, by accident, and we never know. There are all these contingencies that we do not know, but they are unlikely, right? So we need to look at where the main thrust of history is taking us, and I think we need to prepare.
All right.
Yeah.
I'll use that as your famous last words.
No, not last words. I plan to live too.
For today.
For today, okay.
So,
fair enough.
I was reminded of a famous one-liner by Charles de Gaulle.
Okay.
He said, China is a big country inhabited by many Chinese. And I think on that indestructible truth, we can all agree. Thank you very much for your insights.
Great audience, great audience. Thank you.
End of meeting.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right.